A routine traffic stop on a quiet night in Brighton Ridge turns into something far more disturbing when Officer Ethan Keller approaches the vehicle. Behind the wheel sits a terrified 12-year-old boy, and in the back seat, a crying infant. What starts as a suspected DUI spirals into a desperate chase, a mysterious disappearance, and a race against time to unravel a chilling conspiracy. The night shift had been quiet, too quiet. Officer Ethan Keller adjusted his grip on the steering wheel of his patrol car, his eyes scanning the darkened streets of Brighton Ridge. A light drizzle slicked the pavement, amplifying the glow of the street lights stretching into the distance. The town had its fair share of disturbances, bar fights, domestic disputes, the occasional drug bust. But at this hour, the streets were usually still. The radio crackled to life, slicing through the quiet. All units be advised. Report a possible DUI. Silver sedan westbound on Riverton Road. Vehicles swerving in and out of lanes. Tag unconfirmed. Keller reached for the radio. Dispatch. This is Unit 12. I'm near Riverton. I'll check it out. He flicked on his lights and eased onto the main road, eyes trained ahead. Brighton Ridge wasn't big, but the winding roads outside the main square were treacherous at night. It didn't take long before he spotted it. A silver sedan moving erratically, the tail lights weaving between the lines. It veered sharply to the right, nearly clipping the guardrail, before jerking back into the lane. Damn! This guy's going to kill someone. Keller activated his siren. The sedan didn't stop. Instead, it hesitated, slowing just a bit before picking up speed. Come on, don't make me chase you, he muttered, reaching for the radio again. Dispatch, suspect is failing to yield. I'm initiating a stop. A moment later, the sedan's brake lights flickered. Then it rolled to a slow stop near the shoulder. Keller exhaled. He left the engine idling, his hand instinctively resting on the grip of his sidearm. The last time a traffic stop had felt this off, he'd ended up wrestling a meth head who nearly took his head off with a tire iron. Keller stepped out, approaching the driver's side cautiously. The window was down just enough for him to glimpse a figure inside. Small, too small. His gut clenched. Hands where I can see them. The hands, it appeared, weren't the rough, unsteady hands of a drunk. They were small, barely bigger than a child's. Keller hesitated, his brain catching up with what his eyes were telling him. His flashlight beam cut through the dim interior, landing on a wide-eyed, terrified boy gripping the steering wheel so tightly his fingers looked bloodless. What the hell? The kid, 12, maybe 13 at best, stared straight ahead, breathing fast, chest rising and falling erratically. His brown hair was disheveled, sweat dotting his forehead despite the cool night air. Keller's training kicked in. Drunk parents, stolen car, runaway. A dozen possibilities swirled in his head, none of them good. He switched to a calmer tone. Son, what's your name? The boy swallowed hard, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror. A small, muffled whimper came from the back seat. Keller moved his light, and his stomach dropped. A baby, a tiny infant, strapped in a car seat that was barely secure, kicking her feet and fussing but otherwise unharmed. His pulse quickened. This had just gone from strange to something else entirely. Keller softened his tone further. Son, are you okay? Is the baby yours? The boy shook his head quickly, then croaked, Please don't take us back. Something about the way he said it made the hair on the back of Keller's neck rise. Back where? Before the kid could answer, his whole body tensed, his grip tightening on the wheel. Panic flooded his features. Keller saw it too late. The boy's foot slammed the gas pedal to the floor. Hey, stop. The car lurched forward, tires screeching against the asphalt. Keller barely had time to jump back as the sedan sped off, fishtailing wildly before gaining traction. Damn it! Keller sprinted back to his cruiser, yanking the door open and throwing it into gear. The engine roared as he gave chase, siren screaming to life. Dispatch! Suspect fled the stop. Juvenile driver with an infant in the back, heading north on Riverton. Speeds approaching 60. The radio crackled back, but Keller barely registered it. His eyes were locked on the sedan ahead as it swerved between lanes, barely missing a parked truck. The baby's cries echoed faintly from the car's open windows. Keller's heart pounded. This wasn't a joyride. This was a full-blown panic escape. The sedan blew past a red light. If another car had been crossing, this would have ended in a fatal wreck. Keller clenched his jaw. Time to end this before someone gets killed. He flicked his overhead speaker on. Son, you need to stop the car. Pull over now. No response. The sedan barreled forward, taking a hard left onto a side road leading toward the old construction site near Mill Creek. Keller cursed. That road was a dead end. The sedan's wheels skidded as the boy tried to correct the turn, but the pavement was still wet from the earlier drizzle. The tires lost traction. Keller watched helplessly as the car spun out, veering off the road completely. The front end slammed into a ditch, the frame crunching on impact before going still. Silence. Keller barely remembered throwing his car into park before rushing toward the wreck. The driver's door was ajar, smoke curling from the crumpled hood. Keller's breath was heavy as he reached inside, his pulse hammering in his ears. The boy was slumped against the seatbelt, eyes fluttering. Kid, hey, stay with me. Keller checked for injuries, a gash on the kid's forehead, but nothing that seemed life-threatening. He reached for his radio. Dispatch, I need EMS. A weak mumble cut him off. Keller leaned in. What did you say? The boy's eyes barely opened. His voice was so faint. Keller almost didn't hear it. He's coming for us. A cold weight settled in Keller's gut. Who? The kid didn't answer. His head lolled slightly, and he went completely limp. Keller's throat tightened. He turned his attention to the baby in the back seat, still crying, but unharmed. Keller let out a slow breath, trying to ignore the unease creeping up his spine. He had no idea who he was, but something told him this was only the beginning. The hospital's waiting room smelled of antiseptic and stale coffee. Keller leaned against the wall, arms crossed, staring through the glass window of the ER bay. Inside, the boy who had led him on a high-speed chase lay unconscious, and Four hooked his arm. A nurse adjusted the monitors, her face unreadable as the soft beeping of the heart monitor filled the room. The kid hadn't stirred since they pulled him from the wreck. Doctors said he had a mild concussion, some bruising, dehydration. Nothing life-threatening. But Keller wasn't worried about the injuries. He was worried about what the boy was running from. The baby had been taken to the pediatric unit. Aside from being fussy and a little dehydrated, she was fine. That didn't make Keller feel any better. He exhaled, rubbing a hand down his face. It had been over an hour, and they still had no information on the boy's parents. Where the hell was his mother? A voice broke through the silence. So this is your runaway driver? Keller turned. Detective Valerie Cruz stood in the doorway, arms folded. She was in her early 40s, sharp-eyed with dark hair pulled into a tight ponytail. Her reputation preceded her, a specialist in child welfare cases, ruthless with negligent parents, relentless when a child was in danger. Keller had worked with her before. He respected her, which meant he also knew she didn't waste time. Kid's name is Noah Reid, Keller said. 12 years old. No ID on him, but we ran the plates. Car's registered to a Rebecca Reid. Same last name. Cruz raised a brow. Mother, assumed. But we haven't been able to find her. House was empty when officers checked. She frowned. So we got a 12-year-old with no legal troubles, driving a car he shouldn't be in, with a baby in the back seat and the mother's missing? Keller sighed, pulling out his notepad. Yeah. Cruz flipped through the paperwork an officer had handed her earlier. 12 years old. No previous run-ins with the system. No foster care placement. No school suspensions. She tapped her pen against the file. Kid's clean. That's what worries me. Before Keller could respond, a nurse approached. He's waking up, she said. The boy's eyes fluttered open, blinking against the dim light. He looked groggy, confused. Then his body, tense like a switch, had flipped. His gaze darted around the room. Keller stepped closer, keeping his voice calm. You're in the hospital. Kid, you crashed the car. You're safe. Noah's fingers tightened around the blanket. His breathing quickened. Cruz took the lead. Noah, my name is Detective Cruz. We need to talk to you, okay? The boy stiffened. His gaze jumped to Keller, then back to Cruz. Keller knelt beside the bed. Noah, where's your mom? A flicker of something. Pain, maybe, crossed the boy's face. Then he shook his head. Cruz stepped in. Noah, the baby, Rosie, is she your sister? A small nod. Noah, listen to me, Keller pressed. We're not here to hurt you, but we need to know where your mom is. The boy swallowed. I don't know. When did you last see her? No answer. Noah's jaw clenched. Then, in a whisper, he muttered, Mom said not to trust cops. Silence. Keller exchanged a glance with Cruz. Cruz sighed, standing. All right, we'll let the doctors do their job. But, Noah, we're not the bad guys. If you change your mind, you let us know. Noah didn't look at them. Keller lingered a moment longer. We'll keep Rosie safe, all right? The boy finally turned to him. His expression wasn't relief. It was fear. Keller frowned. But before he could ask anything else, Noah turned away, shutting down completely. The evidence didn't make sense. An hour later, Keller stood in the hospital's family lounge, flipping through reports as Cruz paced nearby. A forensics officer had just dropped off what they found in the car, a blood-stained baby blanket stuffed in the trunk, a crumpled note found inside Noah's backpack. Keller read it twice, then a third time. If you're reading this, I didn't make it. Protect them. His stomach clenched. Blood work just came in, Cruz said, handing him a file. Keller flipped it open, skimming the first few lines, then he froze. Blood on the blanket belonged to Rosie Reid. Keller exhaled sharply. She's not missing. Cruz murmured, she's hurt or worse. Keller felt the weight of it settle in his chest. He looked back toward Noah's hospital room. The boy curled up under the thin sheets, refusing to speak. That wasn't just fear. The kid knew something, and Keller was willing to bet he knew exactly why his mother had disappeared. Who was Noah running from? And what really happened to his mother? Is she still alive? Drop your theories in the comments. Don't forget to like this video and stay tuned to see if Keller can unravel the truth and reunite a mother with her children before it's too late. Keller pushed open the screen door of Rosie Reid's house. The rusted hinges creaked under the pressure. The front door was already ajar, as if it had been left open in a hurry. Inside, the place was eerily still. A kitchen light flickered, the only sign of life in the otherwise silent house. A half-eaten dinner sat abandoned on the counter, a plate of pasta, one fork resting beside it. The food had congealed, untouched for hours. Something about it unsettled Keller. It looked too normal, as if someone had planned to finish that meal, but never got the chance. Cruz followed behind, her sharp eyes scanning the space. No forced entry, she noted. Doesn't look like a robbery. Yeah, Keller muttered. She left in a hurry, though. His gaze moved to the living room. That's when he saw it. A faint streak of blood on the floor. It wasn't much, not a pool, not a spatter, just a smudge. But it was enough. Keller crouched, running a gloved hand over the dried stain. Someone was bleeding, but it's not enough to suggest a fatal wound. Cruz stepped closer. So she was alive when she left, maybe. But that still leaves a bigger question. Why? He stood, scanning the rest of the house. The bedrooms were undisturbed. The closet still full of clothes. No suitcases were missing. She hadn't packed. Wherever Rebecca had gone, she hadn't planned on leaving. So what made her run in the middle of the night? Traffic cam footage provided the first real clue. Back at the precinct, Keller leaned over Cruz's shoulder as she pulled up the surveillance footage from a camera positioned on the intersection near Rebecca's house. The timestamp read 2:47 a.m. The grainy footage showed Rebecca's sedan speeding down the road. She was alone in the driver's seat. The baby was likely already strapped in the back. Noah sat beside her, gripping the dashboard. Even in the black and white footage, he looked terrified. But it wasn't just the speed of the car or the way Rebecca clutched the wheel that sent a chill through Keller. It was the way she kept looking over her shoulder, like someone was behind them. Christ, Cruz muttered. She was scared out of her mind. Keller's jaw clenched. Something sent her running. Or someone. Cruz let the footage play. The sedan sped out of view, leaving only the empty road behind it. Nothing followed immediately after. But then, 30 seconds later, another set of headlights appeared on the screen, a dark-colored SUV. The vehicle slowed when it reached the intersection. Then it accelerated in the same direction Rebecca had gone. Keller and Cruz exchanged a glance. "That's not a coincidence," Keller said. Cruz shook her head. "No, it's not." The missing father. They ran the usual checks, custody records, paternity claims, anything that could link Rebecca to someone who might want to harm her. Officially, Noah and Rosie had no father listed. Their birth certificates were blank where a name should be. But medical records told a different story. Cruz flipped through the report, her face tightening as she landed on a name. "Well, we have a lead," she said. Keller read over her shoulder. Eric Foster, Noah's biological father. "Okay," Keller said. "Who's Eric Foster?" Cruz didn't look up. "Depends on who you ask." She pulled up an old file, a domestic violence report from nearly 8 years ago. Rebecca had filed it against Eric Foster, citing repeated threats and violent outbursts. Charges were never pressed. Keller asked, "What happened?" Cruz nodded. Case was dismissed. No follow-ups. Nothing since. Keller exhaled. "That doesn't mean he stayed out of her life." Cruz agreed. "But it does mean she was scared enough to report him. At least once." Keller sat back in his chair, flipping through the file. "All right, so an abusive ex resurfaces after years of silence. She panics, grabs the kids, and runs. Makes sense." Cruz hesitated. "There's just one problem," she said. Keller looked at her. Cruz's mouth tightened. She pushed another document across the desk. Keller glanced down, then froze. Eric Foster was dead, officially, at least 3 years ago. He had died in a house fire in another state. The case was ruled an accident, gas leak, ignition source undetermined. His remains were found in the wreckage. The case was closed. "Tell me this is a mistake," Keller said. "Nope," Cruz said. Case was investigated, ruled accidental, signed off. Man's been dead for 3 years. Keller rubbed a hand over his jaw. "Then explain to me why a 12-year-old kid who's never met his father looked at his picture and told me." He paused, voice lowering. "That's him. That's the man who was in our house last night." Cruz stared at him. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Finally, Cruz exhaled. "Well," she muttered, "either someone faked his death or someone pretending to be him." Something about Eric Foster's death didn't add up. Keller sat in his squad car outside the precinct, staring at the incident report from the house fire 3 years ago. The official ruling was an accident. Faulty wiring, rapid ignition, the entire structure collapsing on itself. The kind of fire that left nothing but charred beams and a pile of ash. But one sentence stood out. "Remains recovered, inconclusive identification due to extensive thermal damage. Presumed to be Eric Foster. Presumed, not confirmed." Keller exhaled slowly, tapping a finger against the paper. If the remains had never been fully identified, then it wasn't a stretch to think that Foster faked his own death. And if that was true, then Rebecca had been running from a man who wasn't supposed to exist. Valerie Cruz was already neck-deep in Foster's past. By the time Keller walked into her office, a thick folder was spread across her desk, old case files stacked beside her. She glanced up. "I found something," she said. Keller pulled up a chair. "Tell me it's good." Cruz flipped to a sealed case file from 8 years ago. Rebecca wasn't Foster's first victim. Keller leaned forward. "This was filed under Elizabeth Run," she said. 3 years before Rebecca reported him for domestic violence. The case was eerily similar. Escalating abuse, controlling behavior, and then one night, she disappeared. Keller frowned. "They never found her?" Cruz shook her head. "No body, no credit card activity, no phone records. After the initial report, she vanished. Case went cold." "So he has a pattern," Keller muttered. "Not just that," Cruz said. She pulled out another document, Elizabeth Wren's last known address. Keller scanned the paper. The location of the fire that supposedly killed Foster. Cruz nodded. He was living with her when the house burned down. That changed things. If Elizabeth had gone missing and Foster had died in the very place she disappeared from, then it meant one of two things. Either he killed her and used the fire as a cover-up, or she helped him disappear. Either way, Rebecca wasn't just another abuse case. She was a loose end, and someone had been trying to tie it up. Rebecca's last known movements painted an even darker picture. A credit card charge under her name was logged at a gas station outside Brighton Ridge 2 days ago. But when Cruz pulled the security footage, the grainy black and white screen didn't show Rebecca at all. It showed a man, tall, dark jacket, hat pulled low over his face. But the posture was familiar, the way he moved, calculated, controlled. Keller's stomach tightened. They watched as the man swiped Rebecca's card, filled up the gas tank, then walked out of frame. "That's not Rebecca," Cruz muttered. "No," Keller agreed. "But I think we both know who it is." They watched in silence as the man climbed into a dark-colored SUV, the same model seen following Rebecca's car the night she disappeared. Cruz tracked a license plate, but the registration led to a shell company based out of Louisiana. A company that didn't actually exist. The pieces were falling into place. Whoever this was, he was covering his tracks. The next part of the case broke open in the worst possible way. That evening, Keller got a call from dispatch. A patrol officer had gone missing, Officer Carl Vance, the same cop who had been assigned to watch Noah and Rosie at the hospital. No one had seen him since last night, the dispatcher said. Didn't check in for his shift, no answer on his phone. Keller's jaw tightened. Last known location? His squad car was found abandoned near the Brighton Ridge Marina. Cruz had been listening over the speakerphone. She didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she exhaled. "Son of a..." She muttered. First Rebecca, then the SUV, now a missing cop. The one person responsible for keeping Noah and Rosie safe. This wasn't random. This was deliberate. That night, Keller sat at the edge of Noah's hospital bed, watching the boy fidget with the corner of his blanket. Noah hadn't spoken much since the first interview. He barely ate, barely slept, but Keller wasn't here to push him. Instead, he placed a photo of the man from the gas station security footage on the bedside table. Noah's fingers twitched when he saw it. His whole body went rigid. "You recognize him?" Keller said quietly. The boy didn't move, didn't breathe, but Keller saw it. The way his shoulders stiffened, the way his fingers curled into the sheets. He knew exactly who that man was. Keller kept his voice steady. "Noah, I need to know the truth." Silence, then barely above a whisper, so quiet Keller almost didn't hear it. "He's not dead." Keller felt a chill creep down his spine. Noah's voice shook, his hands gripping the blanket. "He came back for us," he whispered. Keller swallowed. "Noah, who is he?" Noah finally turned to face him. His face was pale, eyes wide with something between fear and certainty. He didn't blink when he spoke. "Eric Foster." The name hung heavy in the air. Noah exhaled sharply, voice breaking. "He's coming for me now." Keller was still replaying Noah's words in his head. "He's not dead. He came back for us." The kid had spoken the words like confession, like admitting out loud would make it more real. And Keller had believed him. Every instinct in his body told him Noah wasn't just scared. He was certain, but belief didn't mean proof. And proof was the only thing that mattered now. Noah was unraveling. The kid hadn't slept since a confession. He sat up in his hospital bed, eyes darting toward the window every few minutes. He barely touched his food. He flinched at footsteps in the hall. Keller tried to reassure him, but it was useless. "They're going to take me away," Noah said. "A foster home, right?" Keller hesitated. "For now. They're placing you in protective custody with Rosie. You'll be safe." Noah shook his head violently. "No, you don't get it. He'll come for us. You think doors stop him? Locks? You think any of that matters?" His voice cracked. "You don't know him. He doesn't stop. He doesn't quit. He doesn't care who he hurts. He's going to take Rosie. And if I get in the way, he'll kill me." The raw panic in the boy's voice was gut-wrenching. Keller sighed. "You won't be in some random house, kid. You and Rosie are going to a secure child welfare facility. High security. No one gets in without clearance. He won't get to you." Noah clenched his jaw. "He will," he whispered. "You don't understand," Noah continued. "You think you're protecting me, but you're not. You're just making it easier for him." The Brighton Ridge Secure Welfare Center was a nondescript brick building on the outskirts of town, reinforced with 24-hour surveillance, keycard access, and armed security. It was the safest place available for Noah and Rosie. At least that's what everyone told themselves. Keller stayed until both kids were checked in. Noah refused to let go of his arm. "Please," the boy whispered. "Please let me stay with you." Keller knelt to his level. "I promise I will find this guy, but you need to be somewhere safe while I do that." Noah's hands trembled as he let go. Keller turned to leave. He had barely made it to his squad car when he felt it. That nagging feeling, that gut-deep certainty that something wasn't right. He hesitated, then pulled out his phone. One missed call, unknown number. His pulse quickened. Then his screen lit up again. Incoming call, unknown number. Keller swiped to answer. "Who the hell is this?" Static crackled on the line, then a voice distorted, low, crawling under his skin. "Tick-tock, officer. She's already gone." The call connected. Keller spun back toward the building, and then the lights inside the facility cut out. The security feed went dark at 10:23 p.m. The power flickered, emergency lights kicking in too late. The intruders were already inside. Two masked men moved with practiced precision, bypassing doors, slipping past sleeping staff. They weren't fumbling or making mistakes. They knew the layout. They reached Rosie's room first. The baby was asleep in a crib against the wall, unaware of the danger closing in. One of the men pulled a small baby monitor from his pocket and set it beside the crib. He leaned in close, his masked face barely inches from her. Then, in a voice soft enough to freeze blood, he whispered, "You're coming home, little girl." The facility's night guard never stood a chance. By the time security realized something was wrong, the intruders were already at Noah's door. Noah was awake. He'd been awake the whole time. He heard them coming. He scrambled back against the bed, heart pounding. He recognized the way they moved. The first masked man stepped inside, tilting his head. His voice was casual. "Noah," he said, "it's time to go." Noah shook his head frantically. "Sight. Come on now. Let's not make this difficult." Noah's hands balled into fists. "You think I'm scared of you?" The man chuckled. "You should be." Then he pulled off the mask. Noah's whole body went still. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Standing in front of him, smirking, was Eric Foster. Noah didn't even have time to scream. By the time Keller and the responding officers arrived, it was over. The doors to the facility had been left wide open. The security footage had been wiped. Noah's room was empty. Rosie's crib was cold. No sign of forced entry. No blood. No bodies. Just silence. Keller stood in the center of the chaos, hands on his hips, staring at the empty beds where the kids had been hours ago. This wasn't a break-in. This wasn't a random attack. This was a surgical extraction. A man who had been 3 steps ahead from the very beginning. An hour later, they recovered one piece of security footage from a hidden hallway camera the intruders had missed. Keller stood in the precinct, staring at the grainy playback. The time stamp read 10:26 p.m. The hallway was empty. Then a figure stepped into view, a man holding a small, bundled-up baby in his arms. He turned toward the camera, his face unmistakable. Eric Foster. Keller's pulse hammered as he watched Foster pause, shifting Rosie in his arms like she was his own child. Then he smirked like he knew Keller would be watching. Then, still holding Rosie, Foster raised a single finger to his lips, a silent warning. Then he turned and walked out of frame and vanished. The station was a war zone. Detective Valerie Cruz had been on the phone for the past hour, coordinating the Amber Alert for Noah and Rosie. Officers moved in and out of the precinct, updating leads, processing forensic reports, calling in favors. Keller stood in the middle of it all, staring at the frozen frame on the monitor in front of him. Eric Foster. The man wasn't even trying to hide. He'd walked right into the facility, looked straight at the camera, and smirked, holding Rosie like she belonged to him. Keller clenched his jaw. It wasn't just a taunt. It was a challenge. He rewound the footage, played it again, looking for anything he might have missed. Nothing. Cruz slammed the phone down onto her desk. Amber alert's out, she said. But it won't do much good if Foster's already crossed state lines. He won't run, Keller muttered. Cruz turned to him. What makes you so sure? Keller exhaled sharply. Because he's not afraid of us. He's been ahead this whole time. This isn't a man in hiding. He's a man with a plan, and that terrified him more than anything. The first Rayall lead came hours later. A deputy radioed in from the outskirts of town. We found the suspect's vehicle. Keller and Cruz arrived at the scene in minutes. The black SUV was abandoned off a dirt road near Old Mill Road, nestled in thick brush. The engine block was still warm. The doors were left open, but it was the inside of the car that told a Rayall story. Bloodstains on the driver's seat. Fresh. A burner phone crushed beneath the back tire, and on the passenger seat, a child's pacifier. Keller's stomach twisted. Cruz inspected the car's exterior. He torched it, she said. No plates. Been scratched off. We won't get much from it. Keller barely heard her. His mind was already moving. Old Mill Road, a rural area outside local jurisdiction, and, more importantly, a known trafficking route. The first call came as Keller was driving back to the precinct. A known number. He answered without hesitation. Keller. A beat of silence, then a voice, distorted, mechanical, crawling under his skin. You're in over your head. Walk away. Click. The line went dead. Keller gripped the wheel tighter. His pulse hammered. Whoever was behind this wasn't just protecting Foster. They were controlling him. And that meant this went way deeper than just one man. The FBI arrived less than an hour later. They didn't knock, didn't introduce themselves. They just walked in and took over. Keller watched as a man in a dark suit, Agent Marshall Briggs, walked straight into Cruz's office, dropped a stack of federal paperwork on her desk, and said, "This case is no longer under local jurisdiction." Cruz crossed her arms. "The hell it isn't." Briggs didn't flinch. "You're dealing with more than just a kidnapping. This goes beyond Brighton Ridge. Let the professionals handle it." Keller had heard enough. This was our case from the start. And last I checked, we don't work for you. Briggs gave him a long, measured look. "No, you don't. And that's exactly why you're being pulled off." Cruz scoffed. "Let me guess, national security?" Briggs smiled thinly. "Something like that." The room went tense. Keller hated this feeling. The feeling of being boxed out. But even worse was the realization that the FBI wasn't here to help. They were here to bury something. Keller didn't sleep that night. He sat in his apartment, staring at the case file spread across his table. Noah's scared face, Rosie's small hands clutching a blanket, Rebecca's missing persons report, the still frame of Eric Foster smirking at the camera. Something wasn't right. The FBI didn't just take over cases like this. Not unless there was something they didn't want getting out. A knock at the door made him tense. He checked the peephole. Nothing. Slowly, he unlocked the door and pulled it open. The hallway was empty, but on the floor, just inside the threshold, was a single piece of paper. No envelope, no signature, just a shipping manifest. Keller picked it up, heart pounding. There, printed in black ink among a list of cargo shipments, was a name, Rosie Reid. His blood ran cold. She wasn't just kidnapped. Eric Foster wasn't just taking her. He was selling her. And if Keller didn't stop him, he'd never see that baby again. Keller wasn't taking this to the FBI. Not after they'd stonewalled him. Not after they'd taken over the case and buried every lead before he could get traction. They weren't here to help. They were here to clean up, which meant if he and Cruz were going to stop Foster, they had to do it off the books. The manifest was still crumpled in Keller's hand when he stormed into Cruz's apartment. She was already awake, dressed, coffee half finished on the table. She barely looked up. "I assume you're here because you found something?" Keller tossed the document onto the table. Rosie's being shipped out of the country. That got her attention. She skimmed the manifest, her expression hardening. "Cargo ID 4421, she read aloud. "Departure in 48 hours. She flipped to the departure location. MV Blackwood, Brighton Ridgeport. Cruz exhaled. "This isn't just Foster," she muttered. "He's working with a network, human trafficking at an international level." Keller's jaw tightened. Then we need to find him before she's moved. Cruz nodded. And we start with the inside man. Officer Carl Vance was dirty the moment his name resurfaced in their investigation. Cruz did a deep dive into financials. What she found didn't surprise either of them. Vance's bank account saw a deposit of 50 grand in offshore funds 2 days before Noah and Rosie were taken. Keller didn't even blink. Bought and paid for. Cruz's voice was grim. And guess who else's offshore deposits in the same bank? She turned the screen toward him. The account holder's name was Eric Foster. Vance was the weak link. He had leaked Noah's location. He made sure security at the child welfare facility was compromised. Now, Keller was willing to bet he was scared. Dirty cops didn't panic until the heat was too close. And right now, Vance had a firestorm heading his way. Keller and Cruz didn't call it in. They didn't notify the department. They went straight to Vance's house. Vance knew they were coming the moment Keller and Cruz pulled up. They saw it, the curtains shifting, the back porch light flicking off. Cruz muttered a curse. He's running. Keller was already moving. Not today. They didn't bother knocking. Keller kicked the door open, weapon drawn. Vance! The house was half-packed. Boxes overturned, drawers left open. He was leaving town. Cruz spotted an open back door. Keller sprinted through the yard, just in time to see Vance dive into a black sedan. The tires screeched as he peeled out of the driveway. Keller didn't hesitate. He ran for the squad car. Get in. The chase tore through the city. Vance was desperate, weaving through traffic, running lights, nearly clipping pedestrians in crosswalks. Keller stayed on him, pushing the cruiser to its limit. Pull over, Vance, he barked into the radio. Vance didn't respond. Keller gritted his teeth. He knows if we catch him alive, he's a loose end. Cruz nodded grimly, which means whoever paid him won't let him stay alive. The realization hit Keller like a brick. Vance wasn't running from them. He was running for his life. Take the next street, Keller ordered. Cruz glanced at him. What? Vance doesn't need to outrun us, Keller said. He just needs to stall long enough for someone else to take him out. Cruz's eyes widened. A hit. They were hurting him. The second Vance hit the highway. A semi-truck barreled into a sedan. Metal crunched, glass shattered. The impact sent the car spinning off the road. The chase was over. Vance was dead on impact. Keller stood at the wreckage, hands clenched at his sides. Cruz ran a hand down her face. We needed him alive. Keller shook his head. That was never an option. Vance had been a pawn the second he lost control of the situation. They erased him. A tow truck operator walked over, holding a cell phone, miraculously intact. Keller took it, stared at the screen. One missed call, Eric Foster. Keller's stomach turned. This wasn't just a rogue trafficker. This wasn't just a missing kid. They were up against a full-scale operation. Luis Marcato wasn't easy to find. Keller and Cruz had spent the last 12 hours pulling every string they had, leaning on old contacts, chasing down leads that led to nothing but dead ends, until one finally paid off. A name, an address, a warning. He'll talk, but you better move fast. Marcato doesn't stay in one place for long. They found him in a rundown apartment on the east side of Brighton Ridge, tucked inside a complex that looked like it should have been condemned years ago. Cruz knocked twice. Luis Marcato, open up. No answer. Keller tried the handle. Locked. Go around, he muttered to Cruz. She nodded, moving toward the back entrance. He stepped to the side of the door and knocked again, harder. Marcato, you've got 10 seconds before I come in. Silence. Then finally a slow, hesitant shuffle inside. The door cracked open just an inch, a single bloodshot eye peering through. Keller didn't wait. He shoved the door open with his shoulder and stepped inside before Marcato could protest. Jesus, man, Marcato groaned, wheeling himself back in his chair. You cops don't know how to knock. Keller took in the sight of him, a man once known for running girls across state lines. Now half of what he used to be. His lower body was useless, limp, the result of a botched hit years ago. Someone had tried to take him out, but he'd survived, barely. Cruz entered from the back, locking the door behind her. "We're not here for a raid, Marcato. We need information." Marcato smirked, though it didn't reach his eyes. "That's cute. And what makes you think I want to talk?" Keller pulled a chair around and sat down across from him. "Because Foster's back, and we know you used to work with him." That got Marcato's attention. His smirk faltered. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "You're lying." Cruz tossed a shipping manifest onto his lap. "This is his operation. He's moving kids again." Marcato ran a hand down his face. "Son of a..." Keller leaned in. "Tell us everything." Marcato hesitated. Then after a long beat, he sighed. "All right, but I want protection." Keller nodded. "You talk, we make a deal." Marcato's hands twitched. "Fine, but you're not going to like what I have to say." He reached into a drawer and pulled out a USB drive. "What's on it?" Cruz asked. Marcato handed it over. "Security footage from one of Foster's old safe houses. I got it off an ex-runner of his before they put a bullet in her." Keller plugged the USB into his laptop. The video was grainy, black and white, but the image was clear. A warehouse, a line of cages, and in the middle of them, Rosie Reid. Her hands were tied. She was barely conscious, slumped against the bars. And she wasn't alone. Other missing women were there too. Keller's stomach twisted. Cruz zoomed in on the footage. "Check the location timestamp," she said. The coordinates popped up on the screen. Cruz sucked in a breath. Keller stared at the numbers, feeling his blood run cold. The warehouse wasn't out of state. It wasn't in some secret facility. It was right in Brighton Ridge, right under their noses. The operation was moving fast. Keller stood outside the SWAT truck, strapping on his vest. The weight of his holster was heavy against his hip. The air was thick with the scent of gun oil and sweat. The low murmur of tactical prep filled the night. They had their target, a warehouse on the outskirts of Brighton Ridge, tucked between abandoned shipping containers and miles of forgotten industrial sprawl. It looked like nothing, but inside, Rosie Reid was being held, along with others. Keller tightened the straps on his vest. His gut was a knot of tension. Cruz approached, helmet under her arm. "SWAT wants us to hang back," she said. Keller shot her a look. "Not happening." She sighed. "I figured." Keller turned to Captain Rohr, the head of the SWAT team. "I'm going in first." Rohr raised a brow. "We don't need a cowboy, Keller." "I'm not a cowboy. I'm the only one who knows what we're dealing with." The older man studied him. "You too close to this." Keller clenched his jaw. "You tell me, if it was your kid in there, would you stay back?" A long pause. Then Rohr grunted. "Fine. You go in with the first wave. But you follow orders." Keller nodded. "Understood." Cruz muttered, "You're going to get us both killed." Keller checked his weapon. "Not tonight." The assault began at exactly 2:17 a.m. A breached charred blue opened the side entrance. The first team moved in, rifles raised. Gunfire erupted immediately. Traffickers were inside, and they were ready. Keller ducked behind a crate as bullets chewed through the air. A SWAT officer beside him fired a controlled burst, dropping one of the armed men by the door. Cruz stayed on his flank, moving fast and tight. A man popped out from behind a storage rack. Keller put two in his chest before he could pull the trigger. They pushed forward deeper. The warehouse was sprawling, dimly lit. Rows of cages and holding pens lined the far wall. Some were empty, some weren't. Keller's stomach turned. Women, children, all locked up. Then he heard Cruz shout. Keller turned and saw her. Rosie Reid. She was slumped against a cage, barely conscious. Wrists zip-tied. A dark bruise bloomed across her cheek, dried blood on her temple. Keller rushed to her, yanking a knife from his belt to cut her restraints. Her eyes fluttered open. "Keller," she croaked. He pressed a hand against her shoulder. "You're okay. You're safe." She grabbed his wrist. Her fingers were weak, but her grip was desperate. "No," she whispered. "No, you don't understand." Keller frowned. "What?" Her voice cracked. "It's not over." The warehouse was nearly secured. The traffickers were dead or in cuffs, and officers were already escorting victims out. For a split second, it felt like they had won. Then Keller heard it, a slow, deliberate set of footsteps behind him. He turned and his blood ran cold. Eric Foster. And in his arms, Rosie. The baby was asleep, her tiny face pressed against his shoulder. Foster smiled. "Hell of a show," he said. Keller's grip tightened on his gun. Foster adjusted Rosie in his arms, calm, casual. "You don't want to do that." Keller's jaw locked. "Put her down." Foster ignored him. "You ever think about how much time you've wasted chasing ghosts, Keller? You thought you were ahead, but you were never even close." Cruz moved beside Keller, gun raised. Foster chuckled. "Two against one? You really think you have the advantage?" Keller didn't answer. His heart was hammering. Foster's smile faded, and his voice dropped. "Put your gun down or she dies." Silence. The world stopped. Keller could hear his own heartbeat, hear the weight of the moment settling onto his chest. Foster wasn't bluffing. Keller looked at Rosie. So small, so unaware of the danger wrapped around her. A baby, a life, and Foster knew exactly what he was doing. "Don't do it," Cruz whispered. Foster tilted his head. 5 seconds, Keller. 4, 3. Keller lowered his gun. Cruz cursed under her breath. Foster grinned. "Good choice." Then a smoke grenade rolled across the floor. The room exploded into chaos. Keller lunged forward, but it was too late. The air in the warehouse was still thick with smoke. Keller moved through the haze, gun up, pulse hammering. Foster was gone, vanished like a ghost, taking Rosie with him. A sharp cough pulled his attention. Rebecca. She was barely holding herself upright. Her body slumped against a steel support beam. Blood matted her hair, bruises darkened her face. But her eyes were wide with terror. He's taken her overseas," she gasped. "You have to stop him." Keller knelt beside her, gripping her shoulders. Rebecca shook her head, trying to focus. "A ship?" she whispered. "He told me before. Once she was gone, no one would ever find her." Cruz crouched beside them. "We need details. Rebecca, which port? Which dock?" Rebecca fought to stay conscious. "Manifest said Dock 17. Keller frowned. "You saw the manifest?" She winced. He wanted me to hear it. Wanted me to know there was no stopping him. Keller exchanged a look with Cruz. Something wasn't right. The manifest Keller had found in his apartment, the one with Rosie's name on it, had listed Dock 17 as a departure point. But now, Foster wanted them to think it was Dock 17. That meant one thing. "It's a decoy," Keller muttered. Cruz caught on instantly. "Then where the hell is he really going?" Rebecca blinked rapidly, her body fighting the weight of exhaustion. Dock 6. Then she slumped forward. Keller caught her before she collapsed completely. "She's out," Cruz said. "We need medics now." Keller was already on his feet. There was no time. Rosie was leaving the country, and they had minutes to stop it. Dock 6 was not abandoned but quiet. No workers. No trucks. No reason for it to be in use, unless someone wanted it that way. Keller gripped his gun as he and Cruz moved through the shadows, their steps silent against the wet pavement. The cargo ship loomed ahead, massive and imposing, its name barely visible in the dim light. MV Blackwood. This was it. Cruz tapped her earpiece. "Dispatch! We have a confirmed target at Dock 6. I repeat, Dock 6. We need backup now." Static. Then, negative. No units available. Priority has been given to Dock 17. Keller clenched his jaw. The FBI had fallen for Foster's trick. It was just them. Cruz exhaled sharply. "We do this alone, then." Keller nodded. "Let's move." The ship's gangplank was barely down. Keller took the lead, stepping aboard with silent, practiced movements. Cruz followed, gun up, scanning corners. The deck was deserted, too quiet. Then, a baby's cry. Keller's stomach clenched. "Rosie." The sound came from below deck. They moved fast, cutting through tight corridors, past rows of metal containers. The stench of rust and seawater thick in the air. Then a voice stopped them cold. "Put the guns down, Keller." They turned. Eric Foster stood at the far end of the passageway, holding Rosie in one arm. The baby squirmed against his chest, whimpering softly. Foster grinned. "We keep meeting like this." Keller raised his gun. "You're done, Foster." Foster sighed. "Really? You haven't caught me yet." Cruz took a step forward. "Put the baby down." Foster clicked his tongue. "See, that's the problem with you, too. You think you're in control." He pulled a knife from his belt, long, serrated, sharp. Keller tensed. "You want to shoot me, Keller?" Foster taunted. "You sure about that? Because if you miss or I flinch." He tilted his head toward Rosie. A slow, sickening realization settled in Keller's gut. Foster was willing to die. This wasn't a negotiation. This was a trap. Keller moved first. He lunged forward, closing the gap before Foster could react. The knife swung up. Pain exploded in Keller's side as the blade plunged deep into his abdomen. But he didn't stop, didn't hesitate. He drove his shoulder into Foster, sending them both crashing against the metal wall. Rosie slipped from Foster's grasp. Cruz dived forward, catching her before she hit the floor. Foster snarled, yanking the knife free. He swung again. Keller caught his wrist, twisted, a sickening crack. Foster screamed, his arm snapping at the joint. Keller drove his fist into Foster's face, once, twice, a third time. The man staggered back, dazed. Keller grabbed Rosie from Cruz. "Get to the water." Cruz hesitated, eyes flicking to Keller's bleeding side. "You won't make it." Keller's grip tightened on the baby. "I'll make it." Then he ran. The deck was chaos. Foster was behind him, shouting orders to unseen men. But Keller didn't look back. His side was on fire, blood soaking into his shirt. But he didn't stop. The edge of the ship was seconds away. The only way out. Keller tightened his hold on Rosie and jumped. Cold, the water swallowed them whole. He kicked upward, breaking the surface, gasping as the frigid air hit his lungs. Above, he heard the wail of sirens. Brighton Ridge PD. The FBI. They had finally arrived. Cruz's voice echoed from the docks. "Keller, over here." He swam toward the shore, his body screaming in protest. But he kept moving. He had Rosie and he wasn't letting go. Keller's world had blurred into sirens, shouting, and the cold sting of salt water in his lungs. The moment he hit the shore, hands grabbed him, officers, paramedics. Cruz. He could hear them talking, shouting orders, but his only focus was a tiny body clutched against his chest. Rosie. She was crying now, a sharp, piercing wail that cut through the chaos. Keller held her tighter, his breath shaky as he fought the exhaustion dragging him under. "She's okay." Cruz's voice, somewhere close. "We need a medic over here." The way it would have just happened settled deep in Keller's chest. They had gotten her out. But Foster was still on that ship, and Keller needed to be sure it was over. Gunfire rang out from the docks. Keller, barely holding on to consciousness, turned his head just in time to see the chaos unfolding. Foster had made it off the ship. He was running, his injured arm tucked against his chest, weaving through cargo crates as officers shouted for him to stop. He had lost the knife, lost the upper hand. But he wasn't giving up. Keller saw the way it would end before it happened. The moment Foster reached the edge of the dock, he pivoted, gun in his good hand. A final act of defiance. A single officer fired. Foster's body jerked once before he collapsed, landing in a heap against the concrete. Keller watched his last breath leave him. It was over. The trafficking ring fell apart overnight. With Foster dead and his network exposed, the FBI had no choice but to clean up what was left. Arrests were made. Corrupt officials were named. The operation had run deeper than anyone had guessed. Judges, politicians, law enforcement officials, all complicit. But Brighton Ridge PD had cracked it open, and they had saved those who still had a chance. Keller sat in the hospital 2 days later. A fresh set of stitches laced across his abdomen. The pain was dull now, numbed by medication. But it wasn't what weighed on him. The case was done, but not for Noah and Rosie. Their lives had changed forever. The reunion happened in slow, tearful seconds. Noah had barely spoken since they'd found him, his small body tense, his hands clenched into tight fists. But when the hospital doors opened and Rebecca stepped inside, everything, anything, unraveled. Her eyes locked onto her son. Noah's breath hitched. Then he ran. Rebecca dropped to her knees, scooping him into her arms, clutching him like she'd never let go. Tears soaked her bruised cheeks. Her body shook as she whispered, "I'm here, baby. I'm here." Keller stood back, watching the scene unfold. Then Rebecca looked at him, silent gratitude. He nodded once. She turned back to her son. Noah's arms stayed wrapped around her, his shoulders trembling. But then, slowly, he lifted his head. His eyes met Keller's. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Noah walked over, his movements hesitant, as if he wasn't sure it was allowed. He stopped just a foot away. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "Thank you for believing me." Keller felt his chest tighten. Noah's arms came up, awkward and uncertain, and he wrapped them around Keller's waist. Keller hesitated, then knelt down, returning the hug. No words, just understanding. And for the first time since this nightmare had begun, Noah let himself cry. Rebecca decided to leave town. She told them from the day she was discharged. A fresh start. A new life somewhere Foster's shadow wouldn't follow them. Keller understood. Brighton Ridge had been their prison. It was time for something else. Cruz didn't argue, just help Rebecca with paperwork, making sure she had everything in order. Noah didn't say much, but as he climbed into the car, ready to leave it all behind, he rolled down the window. Keller leaned down, resting an arm on the frame. "You'll be okay, kid," he said. Noah nodded. "I know." Then, after a pause, he grinned. "Try not to get stabbed again." Keller huffed a laugh. No promises. Noah hesitated. Then he reached out a hand for Keller to shake. Keller took it. The car pulled away. And just like that, they were gone. That night, Keller sat in his squad car, parked at the edge of the city. The streetlights flickered. The roads were quiet. A rare moment of peace. Cruz had told him to go home, to sleep, to heal. But Keller just sat there, staring at the badge in his hands. For the first time in years, he thought about why he'd become a cop. Not for the job, not for the authority, but for this, for the moments when one small action could change a life, for the chance to believe a kid when no one else would, for Noah, for Rosie, and for every kid who never got saved. He exhaled, tucking the badge back into place. Then he started the car, flicked on the headlights, and drove into the night. The job wasn't over. Not yet. Thanks for watching till the end. If you enjoyed this story, give this video a like. If you haven't already, subscribe for more.